Radio for Readers, Bookmark.
This is Bookmark. I'm Marc Verdeja. The nation's top authors are coming up next.
Bookmark.
The Bookmark program continues with something I've looked forward to all day, an opportunity to talk about the struggle of exiles for truth and freedom. The book is called Cubans, An Epic Journey. We have with us the two authors of the book, Sam Verdeja and Guillermo Martinez. And I know I've murdered the names. And Sam and Guillermo, thank you for being with us today on WNDB's Bookmark. This is a rather lengthy book, and it's very comprehensive in its nature. Talk a little bit about, I've probably done 17 interviews now on books that relate to Cuba, exile, escape, coming to America for freedom and opportunity. What makes this book so different?
Right, Guillermo.
Well, this book is different in many ways. First of all, this book is written by 31 people, 29 Cubans and 2 Americans. We did a history. The book is really divided into 3 or 4 different parts. We have a history of the Cubans in Cuba since Castro, before Castro, Cubans coming over, and Cuban exiles. We did the story between the United States and Cuba during those years, and the story of what has happened to all of those Cubans. Then we did the story of what Cubans have accomplished in the United States, and then we did a story about a little bit on the appendixes of the book. You find out what Cuba was statistically in the world, economic-wise, per capita on TVs, radios, telephones, etc. It's very comprehensive.
Guillermo and Sam, both of you, and I want you both to answer this. You know, I've struggled with this issue for a while. As a radio talk show host, I don't understand why we do not have normalization with Cuba when other countries do. Canada trades with them freely and is prospering as a result of it. We do not. We are attempting to continue to freeze out Cuba, waiting for the Castro brothers to go away. Is that a healthy stance for the United States to have this late in the game?
I believe that it still is. And the reason is Cuba can buy from the United States and from any part of the world anything they want, especially in the case of the United States, medicines and food. The difference is that they have to pay cash in advance. And if you look at the history, Cuba have been very well known for not paying their bills. They did it to the Soviet Union and still Russia, and Russia now, as a matter of fact, don't give them anything in advance without paying. Argentina, Spain, and what happened is, if an American company gives something to Cuba and Cuba doesn't pay, let's say that the embargo, which is the way it's known, the relationship between the two, if Cuba doesn't pay, and it is guaranteed by the Exim Bank in the United States or any bank here, then the American taxpayer will end up paying for that bill. So what we're saying is, and nothing has changed in Cuba in the last 50 years. So I strongly believe that when the 2 Castros disappeared, Raul and Fidel Castro, you will see what happened in China. I mean, this week in China, is a new generation of Chinese taking over. But this is the 3rd time after Mao Zedong disappeared, and the new wave of people there start thinking differently, and then that's why the United States closer and some other countries.
You have in Cuba a totally different situation than we do anyplace else. First of all, the embargo is a myth. There's no embargo.
Because you can get health and food and all the necessities.
Correct? All you have to do is buy it.
Except for cars, is that not true?
No. Since you can't buy. There's a law. There's called the Helms-Burton law that forbids trading with Cuba, but that's for other reasons. But you're saying, why now? 2 American presidents have tried. Jimmy Carter, and he was paid with an invasion of Cuban troops in Africa, and then he was paid with a Mariel boat lift, 125,000 people sent over here within a 5-month period of time. That cost him his presidency, one of the reasons it cost him his presidency. The second one was Bill Clinton, who decided to lift and try and improve relations with Cuba. His payment was anybody who wants to leave Cuba can leave at will, and that's when we had the rafters crisis.
36,000.
36 or 38,000, whatever, who came over in a matter of days and were sent. So Cuba does not want the United States to lift the embargo. So if you go in and you say, yes, we want to lift the embargo, Cuba will ask for something else. We'll put an impediment so that you can't do it, or we'll do something crazy to stop you from doing it because they need to blame the United States.
All right, gentlemen, that's very reasonable and understandable. Help me understand and help our listeners and viewers understand that if we wait out the Castro brothers, that there isn't a cousin or someone else that's waiting in the wings to take their place and continue this tyranny.
Well, if that's the case, then we're no better off than we were when we had the caudillos in Latin America in the 1950s, and the United States decided that they no longer wanted to back Somoza, and they no longer wanted to back Batista, and they no longer wanted to back Trujillo. At some point, the United States should say, enough, I'm not going to accept tyrants living in the Western Hemisphere, and we should impose a real embargo and really try and getting people to do, we're doing this with Iran, we're trying to impose it with Iran. We did it with South Africa, but we have not done it with Cuba.
Excellent points. Gentlemen, did we learn lessons from 1962? Did the Russians learn lessons from 1962? And that is, the Russians really don't want anything to do with Cuba right now. Is it because they're too poor and they have nothing to give back?
I think I think it's very simple. If you read up on the latest things that have happened, after they left Cuba, Mikoyan went back to Cuba and realized that they had left tactical nuclear weapons behind in the island. And Castro wanted to keep the tactical nuclear weapons, which we didn't know that were there. And Mikoyan said, don't leave it. This guy's crazy. He can use it any one of these days. Yeah. And so they took it. And this is all had been coming out as within the last 20 years, when the Soviet Union fell, the NKVD, KGB archives were opened. Then there's been conferences. Khrushchev has been part of these conferences. Gorbachev has been part of these conferences. And there's been a lot of people that have talked about these things. And they were very scared. We were this close because Castro at one point almost had his trigger on the nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, in the last few years, a new bully has come into the neighborhood, if you will, the president of Venezuela. Do we know, either from your writings, research, or general knowledge, what the relationship is between Venezuela and Cuba?
Well, it's the country keeping Cuba afloat is Venezuela. They are giving the help that they lost when the Soviet Union fell. It was substituted by Venezuela, giving them the oil, not only for Cuban consumption of oil, but Cuba takes the oil and sell it, part of the allotment that they get, which doesn't make Venezuelans very happy about it. If you read news from Venezuela, but that's the role that Venezuela is playing with Cuba and 2 or 3 other governments in Latin America.
There is another point to that, which is the payment that Cuba is giving Venezuela is not money, not food, but they're paying in kind. They're sending doctors to Venezuela in payment for oil. They're sending military assistance,
really?
And they're sending
thousands.
And they're sending sports trainers, and then they're paying the doctors. The doctors get a percentage of the pay in Venezuela for them to live. But the rest of the money goes to the Cuban government in Cuba. It doesn't go to the doctors that serve on these missions.
Gentlemen, remember some years ago when there were Cuban advisors that went to Africa? Remember that?
Yes.
I think it was Angola.
And Congo.
How did the country of Cuba, which was ravaged by poverty, didn't really have a lot of money, from my understanding, into its treasury. How did it have the money to support those efforts?
They didn't. It was they were the surrogates for the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
The Soviet Union used Cuban troops in Angola and in Africa instead of Soviet troops.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And that was we detailed all of these things. At one point, Che Guevara was in Congo, and he was being persecuted, unbeknownst to the Cubans, by a group of Cuban exiles working for the CIA. Mm-hmm. And they almost caught up with him on Lake Tanganyika. And they didn't know, and Che left and fled. And he was lucky because the Cubans found out later that Che Guevara had been fighting, so there had been Cubans fighting Cubans,
In
Cubans
Africa.
from the CIA and Cubans from the island as surrogates for the Soviet Union.
Gentlemen, is it true that Cuba has a stronger relationship with China now? We've been hearing things where I come from about drilling for oil, that the Cubans cut some deal with the Chinese and that they have some mineral rights or the ability to explore for oil off of Cuba's shores. Is that true?
It is true, and actually the oil exploration now in Cuba is being done by the Chinese, the Venezuelans, and
The Spaniards.
Spaniards. But China has been very aggressive, not only in Cuba but all over Latin America, and tightened their relationships and buying all kind of minerals and businesses, and they have been very active.
The Chinese, and they've drilled 3 exploratory wells in Cuba, and all 3 have come up dry.
Very unsuccessful.
So they're moving the platform out of Cuba.
Because we've heard that if there is environmental difficulty, if they do find oil, Florida is susceptible to that damage.
Well, absolutely. The Florida Straits, the Gulf of the Gulf current, comes from the north of Cuba. Why do you think the rafters use the current to come up the coast?
So when Florida congressmen or senators tell me there's no threat of that, they're lying to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's as much threat of drilling for oil in Cuba as there is drilling for oil in the coast of Gulf of Mexico, or drilling for oil in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Virginia.
Probably more, because at least in the Gulf of Mexico, the U.S. government put all kind of restrictions on what they can do or not.
Do you think our State Department fully comprehends what's going on with Cuba and its future, or do you think they don't?
I'm
You
sure.
do?
I'm sure they do. But what can you do? You can't. On the list of priorities, right now we're fighting. You're seeing Israelis fighting Palestinians in Gaza. You're seeing Iran seeking enrichment of uranium and doubling its capacity to enrich uranium to 20%, just doubling it. You're seeing an Arab Spring. You're seeing problems in Afghanistan. You're seeing the chaos with General Petraeus and General Allen, and then you're finally seeing that we're about to hit a fiscal cliff here in the United States by the end of the year. Cuba?
There's no
What's
room
that?
on our plate.
That's right.
What's that? I mean, it's a little island speck. Just get away. Don't bother me.
But it could be a linchpin to a whole host of trouble in the foreseeable future.
It has always been a potential for trouble in the foreseeable future, but so far, except for the missile crisis, it has not been trouble in the foreseeable present.
Help me understand a cultural difference, gentlemen. I've been told that there are cultural misunderstandings or prejudice between Cubans and Puerto Ricans, and back and forth. Are you aware of this? Can you share any insight as to why that happens?
Well, it's very different. Can you tell me if there's any differences between people who live in Texas and people who live in Massachusetts?
Yes.
They do, and people have their own differences. Puerto Ricans who live in the central coast of Florida on the I-4 corridor, between Tampa and Daytona Beach, and mainly in Osceola County and Orange County, come from the island, and they're totally different than the New Ricans in New York. Puerto Ricans in that area have voted against Jeb Bush the first time he ran for governor. Twice they voted for Jeb Bush. They voted for Mel Martinez. They voted for Marco Rubio, and now they voted for Obama. So they're a swing community that goes back and forth.
I want to take you back into some history and ask you about the significance of, I believe it was Radio Marti, is that correct?
Yes.
Which was the broadcast into Cuba sponsored by the United States government. Gentlemen, was it effective?
It is. I make political commentaries on radio and TV Marti as we speak right now.
Are there listeners there that are getting the message?
You'd be surprised.
Really?
You'd be surprised that people are not only getting the messages, but we have a program that is filmed in Cuba by dissidents, and we air that program back to Cuba and back to the United States. And it's aired right here in South Florida, also because it's on DirecTV and goes back to Cuba.
Well, Guillermo,
It is like questioning in the 50s and 60s and 70s and all that, if Radio Free Europe was effective or not. Did everybody behind the Iron Curtains listen to it? No. But it reaches a lot of people, good enough for those people to be able to pass the word to other people.
You know how they do it? They take a flash drive, record programs on a flash drive, and when people are sending food and they're sending shirts and ties and things to Cuba, they send those flash drives, and then those flash drives are programming and distribute. So there's another form of distributing program in Cuba, and that's one of them.
Wow. Do you see this administration moving the ball forward in terms of how we handle Cuba, or because of the president's plate being full and this Congress being divided, no action?
There should be some action, I think, but not. I don't think it's going to be anything dramatic.
Remember, I think that he's done as much as he can do. Anything else needs congressional approval. The situation on trade with Cuba was part of a law that was passed, was called Helms-Burton Law, and it was passed during the Clinton administration precisely because of what Cuba did. And as a result of that, you're going to need an act of Congress to lift and to change the relationship with Cuba.
Do we identify the issues as human rights violations? Is that our biggest complaint with Cuba right now?
We have no idea. We forgot. We remember in 2003 when there was a Black Spring, and 75 dissidents were arrested. There's hundreds of dissidents. There's now Arturo Rodiles, who has this program called Estado de Sats, which is a program where 4 people meet in a house in Havana and talk. He's a physician. He's a physicist. He got his doctor's degree in the United States. He got a master's degree in Mexico. He has a degree in Havana University, and he left the country, went back to Cuba, and decided to do some peaceful demonstrations and peaceful Mahatma Gandhi-like, Martin Luther King-like opposition to the regime by talking. They beat him up and threw him in jail, and nobody's talking about it. Nobody hears about it. There's more repression in Cuba now than there was 10 years ago.
All right, and this is my central point. We normalized with Vietnam. We went to war with them. We have normal relations with Saudi Arabia, and we know they cut off hands over there. Yet we freeze out Cuba. To the novice like myself, it seems inconsistent, our foreign policy. Is it?
Well, unfortunately for those people, they did not have a strong number of their exiles or whatever. I think as long as Cuban Americans and others worry about the human rights and have a say in Florida, it will put pressure like the Jewish community in the United States. What's the number of Jews in the United States? And however, they are organized to defend the rights of Israel. And I think we feel our duty to fight for those people their human rights are being abused in Cuba, and we will do our best to you can say put pressure or whatever, but to ask that the Cuban regime is not giving a red light and continue the abuses in Cuba.
You've mentioned some specific countries. Saudi Arabia has oil. We're going to overlook an awful lot of things because of oil. Come on, let's not get ourselves.
So if Cuba had something we wanted, we might not be so.
Yeah, we have relations with Venezuela. You mentioned Venezuela and Hugo Chavez. Chavez owns Citicorp in the United States.
Right.
So you know, it's totally different. You mentioned Vietnam. Well, Vietnam has changed. Vietnam now has a communist government and a capitalist market ideas. When Cuba does something like that, yes, things will change. Until that happens, it's impossible.
Do you go into wet foot, dry foot in this book?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
But let me say something. One thing we do or we don't do in this book is give opinion. In other words, what we do is to try the historical part of it. When was it created? Why it was created? We don't go on whether
You're not advocates for a side.
No.
None of what you've asked us of our opinions is in the book.
It's in the book.
Right.
No, we're giving you our opinion as person, but the book is very historical.
Okay. Exit question. Will history show us that wet foot, dry foot was effective? or is it just a way to sort of bridge the gap?
I think it was a way to bridge a gap, political gap, back then. I think today, unfortunately, I don't think it's working as it was designed to do. A lot of people, unfortunately, come in today, and a year later, they want to go back to Cuba and start visiting everybody. Okay, that was done for political asylum people who were persecuted and all that. If you can go back and forth, you have not been persecuted. You're just an immigrant like anybody. And the problem is that it takes the place of other people. Not taking the place, but other people have to wait 5 years to be a resident, and when Cubans can do it in one. To many people, it's not fair.
It's very simple. I think that's an obsolete policy.
Yes.
Because the Cubans that are coming here with wet foot, dry foot are no longer refugees. I came here and I wasn't able to go to Cuba. I still can't go to Cuba. I've spent 12 years asking for a visa to go to Cuba, and they refused me because
as a journalist.
As a journalist, because they refused me because I went back in 1978 and I interviewed Castro, and they didn't like what I wrote. So they never say no.
You're like on the Cuban no-fly list?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And if I were to fly to Cuba and go to Cuba, I couldn't go on my American passport. I would have to get a Cuban passport, and I'd be subjected to their laws and not be protected by American citizenship.
Gentlemen, you have enriched our broadcast with your comments and your reporting. Cubans, an epic journey. Sam Verdeja and Guillermo Martinez, our guest on the Bookmark program from the Miami Book Fair International at Miami-Dade College. That's Bookmark for this week. If you have comments or thoughts on future authors, send an email to us at our website, bookmark.us. That's our broadcast for today. Thanks for watching.